Mi nombre es Lucia Barrera. Estoy en Sydney, Australia en estos momentos y voy a dar una presentación breve en inglés sobre el trabajo de investigación que estoy haciendo en estos momentos. Así que, the project I'm working on is researching loneliness with young people. The project is called Articulating Experiential Features of Loneliness, Sensorial, Perceptual, and Attentional Traces. Within the context of this project, loneliness can be understood as how one perceives the strengths of the connections that one has with others. It emerges from the way people perceive, evaluate, and respond to interpersonal reality, according to Jones from 1982. While historically loneliness has been identified as mostly affecting aging populations in Australia, just prior to the COVID pandemic lockdowns, research indicated that young people here were experiencing escalating levels of loneliness and social isolation that could lead to depression and social anxiety, a growing public health concern, according to Limitall in 2019. But meanwhile, they're incredibly connected using technology for connecting across demographics and also across geographies. The study specifically investigates how these young people perceive themselves and experience their sense of connection and disconnection to others from an embodied perspective. It primarily does this by locating the felt experience of loneliness, investigating subjective and intersubjective dimensions of it. And I guess I'd like to here just present briefly my research question. So I'm looking at the pre-reflective embodied dimensions of how loneliness is experienced by young people. I guess overall the question is, how is loneliness experienced and communicated by them? So I'd just briefly like to mention the recruitment process. So I've recruited 18 to 24-year-old young people in Sydney, Australia. Essentially, the recruitment was used with young people who self-reported experiencing loneliness, but no self-reported mental health conditions not assessed nor diagnosed. The process of data collection is essentially using three methods. One is through interviews, another one through surveys, and other one using body mapping. So the interviews are the ones I'm going to be talking about today, just very briefly. The interviews are micro-phenomenological interviews as a result of this fantastic course. And I'll be discussing very briefly, the preliminary analysis of where I'm up to with these. So the duration of each interview is about 25 to 35 minutes. I also conducted 4 very brief surveys as a part of this study as well. So using the UCLA loneliness scale, version 3, the social interaction scale, positive and negative affect, and emotional regulation. So those surveys were just to get a very kind of big picture kind of idea as to those particular, to essentially get a big picture idea as to where they sit on those measurements. But for me, what's important is particularly the VR body mapping that I'm using, and also the micro-phenomenological interviews, which both focus on one on the embodied side of things and the other one on the kind of first person reports. So with the body mapping, it's using an existing virtual reality tool that's called EmbodyMap, and it's particularly used for 2 things. One is for perspective shifting, which is great. So it means you've got a headset and the other person has a headset and you can swap perspectives, I guess. And the other is for examining actual, imagined, and implied presence of others.
Sorry, how many people you?
Yes, the initial project was to actually interview 4. I've got 3 interviews to date, which I've transcribed and begun to analyse. but there's one that's mostly, you know, essentially done to date. And that's what I'm just going to be very briefly outlining now. So yeah, I just wanted to just mention in the, I don't have the generic results as yet, but that's the next phase of my research. So at the moment, I'll just be looking at the diachronic and synchronic units. So at a glance, I'll just say that with this first interview that I conducted, I identified that there were 6 diachronic phases. One is initially the sense of unmet need. Then there's second, the sense of disconnection. Then there's a third diachronic unit, which is of going inward. The fourth is what's found. The fifth is a sense of release. And the sixth is a sense of kind of controlling her own functional agency. So with the synchronic, the preliminary synchronic analysis, as you can see in the diagram, I've specifically been looking at the attention. So there's a few different synchronic elements that emerge through this process. Essentially there's attention, and I think that's linked obviously to my research question. The research question is how, so it's the experience. Throughout the initial research, primarily it's looking at the diachronic because of that wanting to look at how the experience is lived over time. However, the way that it's also engaged with was very interesting for me in terms of looking at the modes of attention and also the contents of attention. So the modes of attention, there's essentially 3 different elements that emerge, or characterized by the modality of attention, focalized or dispersed, the direction of attention, whether it's kind of inward facing or outward facing, and the perceptual position, first, second, or third person. The contents, I won't go into a lot of detail, but with the contents, there's the perception of other, which is something that was obviously a really big part of the whole interview. And then there's also the sensorial modalities of how that was experienced. So the sense of fragmentation, pressure, internalization. So at this moment, I'm essentially beginning to look at the dynamic lines and to try and establish how those particular elements of attention are understood throughout the different phases. And that's where I'm up to at the moment. So that's still being developed at present. So I'd say that at a big picture, there's the 3 participants. One expressed that there's I guess a sense of agency helped her move through the experience, a sense of kind of reconnecting with her own sense of agency. The second participant had a really strong connection to others and spoke, there was kind of a sense of less kind of focus on the kind of outward connections and more on the internal experience. And the third was very much looking at a sense of being a part of a group was integral to her experience. But that still needs further development. So I'm just only beginning to look at those other 2 interviews. The method itself, I found it incredibly useful specifically for this study, because I am looking at the kind of the experiential shifts throughout the experience of loneliness. So the diachronic was really interesting for that. I think one thing that I'd love to find is a way of capturing some of that more intersubjective communication between the interviewer and interviewee. So finding a way of documenting that, which I have done. So I'm looking at how to kind of integrate things like eye contact, kind of gesture, intonation and rhythm. And so one thing is having that in a spreadsheet, but I think there's other ways that we could probably use that as well to kind of capture and utilize that data. At the moment, I'm looking at the virtual reality body mapping. And so that's something that I'm just starting up now. So yeah, thank you very much.